Let's start off with your general sentiments, your impressions of the State of the Nation address.
Well, I think that business certainly sees it as a very comprehensive and indeed a confident message, which is focused very much on growth and employment and what we need to do if we want to get our growth rate up and create many more jobs than we seem to be doing at the moment. And the other point, of course, is the emphasis on the role of the private sector, and certain incentives have been offered. So there's quite a bit for the business community to consider and respond to in terms of the messages in the State of the Nation address.
The most recent unemployment number that came through, we're sitting at 24% unemployment, down from 25.3% in the third quarter. Private sector employment hasn't increased dramatically as much as what we've seen on the government level. President Zuma was talking about private sector being far more involved, but some analysts out there say that you can't talk about job creation and unemployment without talking about the rigidities in the labour market as well, and labour policies in particular.
Yes, that is quite important when you get past the cyclical stage. Now, we're coming out of recession, we lost jobs, so quite clearly the picture is looking worse than usual. But we must remember, just to confirm your point, that when we were growing at 5% plus before the global recession, we only brought unemployment down to about 23%. So clearly there are structural issues that are still with us. And if you look at earlier surveys and socioeconomic programs, they identify some of the constraints that make it difficult to create jobs and to grow as rapidly as we ought to. Because quite clearly this country has the potential to grow at 6 or 7%, provided we can get these constraints removed over time. So quite clearly, from the point of view of the structural impediments to a more employment-friendly environment, we will have to address them.
Tax incentives for business, and this is also very important, 20 billion rands worth of tax incentives. We're looking at the IDC setting aside 10 billion rand over the next 5 years. We're also looking at a jobs fund worth 9 billion rand. Is it an important thing to throw money at the jobs scenario, or do you think regulation is also a very important element?
I think, firstly, with the money, it is important to put money on the table, and I think this is a commitment from government, and it's up to the private sector to utilize that. I think the problem has always been with this kind of investment and these projects is to make them happen. They've got to be implemented, and we must be sure that that happens. Secondly, I think often these incentives and these instruments are not designed sufficiently well to get the response that you want. And I would simply urge that in the implementation phase, there should be consultation on the 40 billion rand and how can best be deployed, make sure that it happens, that you get the responses from the private sector. That said, you then must go beyond that and say, but there are things that lie beyond money in the policy environment, whether it's the debate about nationalisation or the labour laws. That also affects the environment within which business has to take decisions, investment decisions, employment decisions, and especially small business is really quite hard hit by the regulatory framework. And what we've got to aim at in the whole new growth path scenario, and that is a commitment in that document, is, as the phrase goes, we want smart tape, not red tape.
Well, Mr. Parsons, when you look at some of the comments made by Anglo-American CEO Cynthia Carroll, she was very harsh in some of the things that she said, but what really stuck out for me is that investments into South Africa that is going to ensure sustainable investment. Businesses want to know that within 30, 20 years or 50 years time, their investments and the investment into the country is going to be quite safe. What is the biggest issue right now, given the fact that you are on the pulse of the business scenario in South Africa? What is the biggest issue facing business right now? Is it the red tape that you're alluding to, or are there other peripheral issues as well?
I think perhaps the most important point here is, and this is really what the new growth path is trying to do, is to project a message of certainty and predictability. That's really what business wants when it starts taking longer term decisions. They want to know where will they stand in a few years' time, and that the rules of the game will not change drastically so that whatever they've decided will turn out to be unprofitable or will not have the outcomes that it wants. So quite clearly the important issue here is to create an environment within which that certainty and that predictability is there for both the domestic and the foreign investor. Then I think the next step is to engage with business, and that's a commitment from President Zuma, to engage with the private sector in an effective way, because even when you talk about some of the good things like infrastructural spending, we need to use public-private sector partnerships on a far bigger scale to make it happen. Because one of the scenarios has been, we've been here before with many of these issues. Now we've got to make sure they're different. And I think that's the message that comes through from President Zuma. There is a commitment. We're going to do it differently because we're going to make it happen. And we in the private sector must come to the party and help to really make it happen.
That has been spoken about before, public-private partnerships as well. So it has something that has been on the agenda. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, it's all about implementation. What is BUSA's stance on nationalisation in the country, nationalising South African mines? What is your stance on that?
Well, I think we found that it's not been a very helpful debate as far as investment is concerned. And the important point here is, yes, of course you can have a robust debate, but a debate has to be managed, and we must understand that you're not talking about an incremental change in policy, you're talking about quite an important change. So there's a price tag on the debate, and that is uncertainty and indeed a lack of predictability. So really we have to manage these debates well. We must manage them in the long-term interest, because at the end of the day, what President Zuma wants, what business wants, what Labour wants and other stakeholders want is a stronger and a better economy, a bigger economy, one that will create jobs and grow over the years. And the important point here is that at the end of the day, what you also have to do, you have to ensure that you carve out a much bigger chunk of world trade and a much bigger chunk of world investment to support your growth and employment targets. And that's the challenge we must take up from the President and run jointly to ensure that we get the right outcomes.